Hello and welcome to the intersection of poverty and trauma. My name is Dan Jurman. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Advocacy and Reform. Uh, Today we're going to talk about the many causes of trauma that are specifically directed to poverty. There are many more causes of trauma out there, but today we're talking about that overlap and the feedback loop that exists between trauma and poverty. To start with, there's a definition of trauma that has been put into PA's trauma-informed plan. You see that in front of you now. Trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. Depending on the presence of resilience factors, trauma can create biologically based responses and can have long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's learning, relationships, functioning, and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It's important to note that not all individuals will experience potentially traumatic events in the same way, and that people's reactions to trauma are different. So again, based on resiliency level and resources. Um, when I do this training, I often, in person, will give this case study. A Latino, born illegitimate to a 16-year-old single mother, born in a family with no college graduates, grew up in a home plagued by substance abuse and domestic violence, homeless for 6 months, received welfare, food stamps, and Medicaid, multiple drug dealers and addicts in his family, and then how does the story turn out? For the purposes of this training, I'm going to skip to the end and let you know that the answer is, this is me. This is my case study. The answers that I'll get when I'm live and in person have ranged over the years from he's dead, he's a drug addict himself, he's a drug dealer himself, he's in prison, he's living in poverty, he's repeating these cycles. I tell this story for a couple of reasons, and it's not to say that I've done anything extraordinary. I've worked hard. I'm not going to lie about that, but I've also been very, very lucky. I can point to very specific instances of luck that have led to me being where I am today, working in the governor's office. And one of those is my mother was 16 when she had me, but her sisters were 14 and 12. And so I was the world's greatest baby doll. I didn't need batteries. I did everything. And my aunts and my grandmother, who was a stay-at-home mom, used to do all sorts of things with me, especially play school. And so my aunts would play school with me, and I learned how to read and write before kindergarten. I learned how to do simple math before kindergarten, just because they played with me and spent time. It was like having my own Head Start program. Neither of my aunts ever got out of poverty. Both died in drug-related instances, one from years of damage to her body and one from an overdose just a couple of years ago. And so they set me on a different trajectory when they were children themselves, and then ended in the same cycle as so many of my family members have. The other one was when we were homeless. My mother could only find one landlord who would take her housing voucher, and he happened to live in a much smaller town than we lived in. We lived in the largest geographic land area city in New Jersey, Vineland, New Jersey, and to go to school and do anything after school, you had to have transportation because the bus ride was so long. The school was far from where we lived. So when we became homeless and ended up having to move to literally the smallest town in the state of New Jersey, everything was in walking distance. And so I was able to do extracurricular activities. I didn't need transportation after school to be involved in things. And that also set me on a different trajectory. And I could probably name a bunch of other things that were just luck that added to my ability to be where I am. The other reason I bring this up is that so often what happens for us is we see a story and we picture a person, or we see a person and we picture the story. And so often we're wrong. And so our perceptions and how quickly we judge people and the qualities that we ascribe to people are so often off base. And that's a big part of how we build the mythologies that surround poverty. And those mythologies can create trauma. If you come away from today's training with nothing else, I want you to know that there is no culture of poverty. There's just human behavior and context driven by psychology and brain science. And when we other people, again, we communally create trauma. When we call people takers, when we, all the different things that we do in, in political seasons and other times, when we create these stereotypes, we are creating trauma. And it's important to know that. I'm going to take you through a series of photos and many things that I'll bring up throughout this training. Some of them may be graphic or triggering to people. And if that happens, I invite you to pause the training and step away, do some breathing and things that help you calm yourself if you've experienced trauma yourself. But here we see a group of young men, clearly in a gang. They are wearing the same colors. They have a lot of the same body art. They're showing pride in membership. They have hand gestures that mean something very specific to them within the group that they've created. And as I show these images, I'm not arguing that these are good patterns of behavior, but what I want you to do is look at the core of the behavior. What's at the heart of it, and compare it to other behaviors like this group of young people who are wearing the same colors. They're covered with body art. They are making hand gestures that mean something specific to them in the group that they've created. There's pride in belonging to this group, and they want people to know that they belong to it. I did some work, anti-poverty work in Tampa, Florida. This is the USF Bulls. And so I can pretty much tell you that I would bet that this group of young people has more substances in their bloodstream than the young people in the previous photo. But the core behavior of belonging to this group and belonging to the previous group is the same. I'd also say that sometimes after a game, a loss or a win, groups like this that we're looking at right now have gone out and committed crimes and done damage to their communities. Again, I don't want to talk about the criminality or what the group is doing so much as the core psychology behind the group or the actions that we'll look at in a couple of these photos coming up. Here we have a big screen TV. I've worked for many years with the United Way's VITA program, which is a volunteer income tax assistance program, and heard the story, or at this point, I don't know if it's mythic or not. I'm sure it happens. I know it happens sometimes, but that people would get their taxes done and then immediately go out and buy a big screen TV. Well, it just so turns out that there's been studies done. Stanford and Berkeley have done studies that that actually show relationships are the key thing for people to survive in poverty. Stanford found that people get tens of thousands of dollars of value from the relationships that they have, trading and bartering with neighbors and friends and family. That in some cases, in many cases, for people living in poverty, that income is from trading is worth more than the cash value of any employment that they have. And so it's actually crucial that they have as many relationships as possible. And so in that kind of economy, which is not the middle class economy that so many of us know, but in that kind of economy, can you at least see the value in having the best television set in your neighborhood for the big game or for a television show or some other event? Again, I'm not arguing that it's a good idea to go out and spend your money on a big screen TV after your tax return. But we shouldn't judge that through a middle class lens, understanding the vast differences in the economy of people living in poverty and how it is that they actually survive, the real context of what's going on. I would also argue that, that the middle class has had behaviors very similar. Back during the Great Recession, a large number of people that I know of had houses they couldn't afford, that they went out and bought, put on credit, and ended up underwater. When the recession hit. And similarly, many times buying in these neighborhoods is about status and networking and doing better within the middle class. And it didn't turn out so great for folks who found themselves underwater. Nails. Nails is one that I've heard all throughout my career from social workers. Essentially, the conversation goes something like, how can that person afford to go out and get their nails done when they can't afford to eat? Again, if relationships are the key to surviving poverty and they're worth more than your cash income, can you see the value in being charismatic and looking like you take care of yourself and looking attractive and interesting? There's value to that, even if it's just on a subconscious level, to trying to attract more resources, which in this case is relationships. I'd also point out that in the life of a person living in poverty, especially a single parent, there are very few opportunities for someone else to take care of you. And so there's a therapy involved in having someone spend even 30 minutes on your nails, just taking care of you when you're spending every day of every year taking care of other people. Also, again, for the middle class, if you've ever gone out and gotten a massage and you put it on a credit card, you technically couldn't afford it that day. And now you're going to pay an additional 29% for that massage because you needed the therapeutic impact of that when you needed it, and not when you had saved up enough for it. Smoking. Smoking was a big one for me. When we were living in poverty, my mother was still a pack-a-day smoker. And I was about 14 when we were homeless and things were at their worst. And I just remember being horrible to my mother, nagging her all the time about smoking. We'd be eating hot dogs for the third day in a row for dinner, and she's smoking, and we could barely afford the hot dogs, and so we'd get into arguments all the time. And I when I was 17 and I actually bought my first car, I remember putting a no smoking placard on the passenger side dashboard just so there was one place that I could keep my mom from smoking. But when we were just talking about therapy and therapeutic needs in the last slide set. People living in poverty don't take vacations. You can't take time off from the situation. You can't go to the beach for a few days. This was my mother's vacation, and she'd take it 10 minutes at a time in the middle of very stressful days. And the other piece of this is it's a drug, and it's addictive, and it helps to smooth out those high stress moments and days that someone is living in when they're living in poverty. In the middle class, we have a lot of similar stuff. I'm a Dunkin' Donuts guy myself, but I'm pretty sure a large or a venti, I think, of one of these costs about the same as some packs of cigarettes. It's an expensive habit, but it's a drug, and it helps smooth you out and get you through those high stress days. And so, again, a lot of times, I'm not saying that cigarette smoking is good for you, and neither is too much caffeine. What I'm saying is the core behavior. The core behavior is not so different, even though we try to other each other and make people sound different, and they're not at their core. When I worked in Tampa, we had an old, nearly burnt out mall. It was half empty, except for a handful of stores that hung on. And whenever a new sneaker would come out, people who tended to be brown, tended to be in hoodies, would be lined up. And the news media was incredibly condescending. Why are they waiting in line in the cold for this? It's not that different than last year's sneaker. Boy, it's $100. That's really expensive. The coverage was very different when it was a lot of middle class and higher, mostly white folks in line for a phone that just was like a quarter of an inch bigger this year, or didn't have a jack for the earbuds this year. It cost $1,000, but the coverage didn't make these folks sound like they were wasting their time. And so, core behavior is the same, and we tend to judge people. What I'm getting at is this group of young men joined this group for exactly the same reasons that this group of young men joined this group. I'm in a place where things are scary. This group is going to give me some protection. I'm going to wear their colors, and everybody's going to know that I belong to something. I have to do really stupid things to get in, things that could even kill me. And once I'm in, though, I'm going to have peer mentorship. I'm going to have a hierarchy that I can climb. I could someday lead this group. If I'm a part of this group, maybe I'll make more money because of being a part of this group. The key psychological factors are the same. And it's important to understand that. And this group that we're looking at right now might also be up to illegal activity. Again, I'm not talking about whether it's good to be in a gang. I'm talking about the core psychological drivers that lead people in that direction. I first came to that thinking thanks to my middle son. This is a couple of pictures of him here. When we first moved to Florida, he, as his favorite activity, used to run across the living room and throw himself at the sofa, bounce off of it onto the floor, laugh hysterically, and do it all over again. And he was 3 at the time. He had just turned 3. And I thought, boy, I don't know what to do with this behavior. You know, either he needs some therapy or sports, and sports was much less expensive. So we went with sports and gave him an outlet for all that energy. And if you've never watched 3-year-olds play flag football, it is worth it just for the comedic value alone. And that first day, he put on his little jersey, and the coach had such a hard time getting these little guys to focus. They'd be picking grass. I mean, my son played with the cones in the end zone a lot, and anything but pick up the ball and run it from one end of the field to the other. And when it was all over, 45 minutes, his little blue jersey was muddy and gross and grass stained, and we tried to get him to take it off back at our van and put on a clean shirt, and he fought us tooth and nail. You saw my case study. I never met my biological father, so for my kids, they've had me every day of their lives, pretty much. You know, telling them that I love them, reading them stories at night, being there with them and being present. My wife and I both, and so they've had everything, and still 45 minutes with strangers was enough to make my son kick and scream about not taking off that shirt because he belonged to something. And so I remember working in Tampa and talking to someone who ran a scholarship program for children who were at risk, and I was talking about the factors that make kids want to join a gang, and she replied, "Yeah, those kids can be that way." And my response was, "No, no, all kids are that way. All human beings want to belong to something." When I got back after that flag football game to the organization I was running, which was an anti-poverty organization, I started asking the question in a team meeting, what are the factors that gangs use to recruit and retain our kids? We had a lot of gang activity in the Tampa area. And we filled up several giant Post-it sheets. And when I looked at what was up there, you know, peer mentorship, the opportunity to be protected, to protect your family, to make more money, being involved, feeling important in your community, belonging to something. And I said, "What do you all see up there?" And a woman who'd worked for the organization for about 10 years sheepishly raised her hand, and she said, "That's everything we should be doing." And that's just it. So again, when we miss the point that folks who are living in poverty have the same psychological drivers that we do, when we try to turn them into some kind of other who belongs to some other culture, I think we do real harm, not just to them, but also to our ability to succeed if we're in helping professions. You know, again, all of us need the same things. Another big point that I want to make to you today, especially as we talk about some other forms of trauma, is that our brains react the same way when we don't get the things that we need. And we're going to talk a lot about that. I also want to take a moment and pause and talk about chronic stress from COVID-19 and just 2020 as a year in general. It doesn't matter which side of this equation you're on. You know, you lost your job or you're working from home. Both have added new stresses. Your kids are in school, your kids are online. Again, either way, all kinds of stresses, fears, anxieties that we're dealing with every day. You lost a loved one or you think it's a hoax. Either way, you're feeling chronic stress and possibly traumatized. You can't visit your parents who are at home or your parents who are in a facility. You have comorbidities or you've already had it and you're a long hauler. So you're afraid, or now you're in it, and there are long-term effects. You're afraid of the police, or you're afraid of the protesters during the current civil unrest that we have going on right now. You think one candidate that just ran for president is a criminal or a socialist, whatever it is that you think is going on there, you're feeling chronic stress and possibly trauma. You don't feel safe at work, or you want everything to open up. Again, I just keep pointing out to people, every single Pennsylvanian is feeling at least chronic stress right now, if not full-blown trauma, depending on their, again, resiliency and their resources. Everyone is at least feeling chronic stress. And that's important to understand because there are real impacts to that. Some of the signs of chronic stress and trauma: irritability, which can sometimes feel extreme, fatigue, headaches, difficulty concentrating or an inability to concentrate, rapid disorganized thoughts, difficulty sleeping, digestive problems, changes in appetite, feeling helpless, a perceived loss of control, low self-esteem, loss of sexual desire, nervousness, frequent infections or illnesses. This is how we're wired. When we feel chronic stress, it has real effects to us, not just on our behavioral health, but on our physical health. And so I know I'm not my best right now. I've been joking with people that I'm at Friday afternoon brain by Wednesday morning every week. I just feel exhausted. I can't think as clearly. My temper is shorter. These are all things that that I think we're all coping with as we try to deal with these extra stresses that are here day after day after day since this pandemic began. One of the important things to understand, and I think an incredible moment for potential empathy throughout the Commonwealth and the country, is that people living in poverty, and also people who've experienced racism and discrimination, we're experiencing chronic stress and trauma like we're all feeling right now, every day of every year prior to 2020. And so when we thought we've had great plans or programs or interventions, and we've tried to get people to plug into them, what we're all feeling right now is one of the barriers that they felt to being able to succeed. And so not understanding their context has been a barrier to being successful in helping people get to the outcomes that we'd love to see them get to. And if we can just adjust our thinking to understand that, I think we can do some amazing work in the future. So let's talk about some of that. Chronic stress from finances. Here's the poverty guidelines. Family of three, gross monthly income, $1,778. And a lot of times when I'm doing this training and in a longer format, I'll have folks sit down in groups and try to do a monthly budget. Start putting it in there. Rent. In Lancaster County, where I live, average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, an affordable apartment, so-called, is $900 a month. That doesn't leave you with a whole lot left after that for everything else that you would need for that family of three, whether it's 2 parents and 1 child or a parent with 2 children. You can't stretch it. Transportation, healthcare, food, all utilities to go along with that $900 a month. Before you know it, you're in the red, you're underwater, and you can't make it work. What troubles me as we do this sort of helping work is how often we'll call our support for these families financial literacy. Words matter. I was an English lit major. Words are very important to me. And when you say something is a literacy program, what you're implying is that I'm illiterate. And in this particular case, I'm not illiterate. I just don't have enough income. Even the most financially literate person, Warren Buffett, couldn't make $1,778 a month work for a family of 3 because it doesn't. And so we've got to have honest conversations. It's not that this family needs to budget or coupon clip. They need more income. And again, this is without subsidy. But even with subsidy, it's usually not that impactful. So when we talk about this, I prefer the language of financial empowerment. I think, as I stated earlier, families who've lived in an economy of sharing with others and relationships being their most important capital don't tend to adjust well to even having money. We see this in sports celebrities and lottery winners. How many football players are wealthy beyond their wildest dreams until they stop playing? And how many of them, as soon as they get signed, go out and do relationship building things like buying cars for people and throwing parties and buying houses for people. We hear it all the time because they're still in a relationship economy in their minds, and no one ever gave them the financial empowerment to understand how that much money can and should work for them and their families. There's nothing wrong with helping to take care of your family when you've made it. But we've got to help people understand. But the first piece is getting them the income so that they can understand how it applies. It's not telling them that they don't understand money when they clearly aren't making enough to get by. Again, even if you get the subsidy, the average family of 3 receiving TANF gets $486 per month. That extra $486 still isn't going to make that budget work. And so we've got to have honest conversations about what would really end poverty. Living wage work, health insurance, working first shift. There are some really clear things that we can focus on that would help families get out of poverty and help break the generational cycle. But when we just tell people it's on them, that if they just did better with their $1,778 a month, again, we're creating trauma. And there's trauma and chronic stress just in trying to make that budget work and shifting the numbers around. Like, I won't pay the electric bill this month because I have to pay the rent or they're going to kick me out. But then next month I won't pay the rent, so I can pay the electric bill, so they won't shut it off. I remember from my own family experience, just the trauma of hearing a knock at the door in case it was someone collecting a bill or the landlord showing up, and my mother would tell us all to be quiet. I'm 50 years old now. I still feel my blood pressure go up when I hear someone knock at the door. I don't want to answer it. And it's been a long time since I couldn't pay my bills. Those stresses stay with you. Those triggers from those stresses stay with you if you've been immersed in them long enough. Just like COVID-19, I think we'll be recovering from for a generation. My great-grandmother, who survived the Great Depression, still had all kinds of behaviors to the end of her life in her 90s. Decades after the Great Depression, she was still doing things that came out of the chronic stresses and the traumas that she felt from surviving those days. Here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we've all seen for a really long time. What I want to point out here is that chronic and toxic stress and trauma all live at the bottom, where we don't have enough food, water, and shelter, where we're worried about our safety and security, that fear. They prevent us from moving up, and we've known this for a long time. As neurobiology has become more prevalent and science has continued to advance, we start to know more why we can't move up when we're stuck in those places, and what it is that's keeping us stuck there, and we're going to talk about that. Here's a brain scan of someone who has a healthy brain and someone who has experienced long-term chronic stress. And what happens is the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that's in charge of executive function, the part of the brain that regulates emotion and solves problems and makes decisions, it gets shut down. That's why I'm not my best self during this pandemic, or the political unrest that's going on in the country. That's what happens to people experiencing chronic stress every day because of poverty or other factors in their community that make them feel unsafe. That part of the brain is automatically shut down. You don't get a say. And the more primitive part of your brain that's in charge of survival and your fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in. It wants to keep you alive. It's a good impulse initially, when we were surviving as cave people, but it doesn't serve us well in a modern context to have that part of the brain shut down so often because of chronic stress. Another piece of neurobiology and advancement is in the study of scarcity. And there's a great podcast that NPR had out a couple of years ago on this. And essentially, the easiest way for me to describe it to people is to ask if you're an excellent shopper when you go grocery shopping hungry. And if you're anything like me, the answer is no, if you're being honest. And there's a reason for that. Again, the part of our brain in charge of keeping us alive doesn't like us to think about other things when we haven't had enough to eat, or when we're in some way not getting one of our basic needs met. In fact, our brains won't let us think about something else until we take care of it. So if we get hungry enough, and especially, we're talking about a grocery store, and I'm joking, but if you're hungry every day, you can't focus on schoolwork. You can't focus on doing a good job where you're employed, because your brain won't let you, not because you're a horrible student, not because you're a bad employee. Your brain won't let you. It's science. They did a great study, I believe it was in India, and they followed farmers who were wealthy for half the year and living in poverty the other half of the year. And what they found was when they were living in poverty, because the money from their crops had run out, and so now they had to spend 6 months living in poverty and scrimping and waiting for the next crop to come in, their IQs went down on average 10 points. 10 points. And when they brought their crops in and were wealthy again for 6 months, their IQs went up again, on average 10 points. And so our ability to think clearly is affected by whether or not we have what we need. This is all of us. This is not just people living in poverty. This is every human being who has normal brain function. Scarcity it really affects our ability to think, just like that chronic stress does. It's almost the same impulse, that the frontal lobe is getting shut down to force the brain to focus on what's missing or what's dangerous. Chronic stress from housing. So for most of us, I think when we think about the kind of house we want, we think about the same general amenities. I want a 2-car garage, I want a decent sized kitchen, a living room, enough bedrooms for me and all of my kids, maybe a game room or a finished basement to add something to it, 2.5 bathrooms, the list of what we usually see on realtor.com or Zillow or wherever we're looking. The most attractive houses have pretty much the same amenities. But for our folks who are living in affordable housing, um, it's still a pretty bare setup for folks. This is a sample of a typical 2-bedroom apartment for affordable housing. You might be talking about 900 square feet for the whole family. Kids are sharing a bedroom. The parent might be sharing a bedroom. You might have to share the whole apartment because $900 a month is a lot, and you might need another adult, another generation of your family or a cousin or someone else to come in and split the rent with you. You might be violating the lease if you do that. And if your landlord is a slumlord, the fact that you're violating the lease means that you also can't complain about all the things that are wrong, like mold or vermin or something else that's going on, fire hazards in the apartment. We know that your housing shouldn't exceed 30% of your income, but we already saw for someone who is at poverty level, it's well exceeding their income to be in an apartment like this. When I'm talking to school districts and doing trainings there, I also often point out, where do you do homework? Like, where do you have any private space, quiet space to be able to do homework and thrive? And so homework becomes an issue of inequity. Even if you give out an equal number, like equality can be inequitable. If you give out equal homework to all of your students, that can create inequities for the students who have to go back to this setting as their living setting. And this creates all kinds of, again, extra stresses, extra things for a parent to be concerned about when this is your living situation. There's also chronic stress from time, and this is often overlooked. And so one of the exercises that I often do is have a group put together a 24-hour pie chart for a single mom with 3 kids. And here you see she's got kids who are 4, 7, and 9. She's got 3 bus trips, which I based off the average trip times here in Lancaster County. So she goes from home to her first job, and then from her first job to her second job, and then from her second job home again. And the trips, including waiting time, are 30, 40, and 45 minutes. And then she has 2 jobs, one where she works 6 hours and one where she works 4 hours. And so when I have groups do this pie chart, this is generally what it looks like. Out of a 24-hour day, 12 hours of, or half, 50% of her day are spent on work and transportation. And then the rest of her time, she's trying to do the things that you would normally do with a few kids. She's got to get them to different places in the morning and get them back from different places in the evening, or get someone else to do it. We go back to that relational economy. Who's babysitting for me? Who's picking up my kids for me? Because with those jobs and that transportation, it probably isn't her. She's got to help them get dinner ready. She's got to do chores herself. Maybe she finds a little time for TV in there and gets her kids to bed. And with all of that, I think they were pretty generous at giving her 6.25 hours of sleep. This is important because we often talk about the financial resources that people living in poverty don't have, but we rarely talk about the poverty of time and what it does to not have enough time. And I appreciate the shape of a pie chart because it also could be a hamster wheel. And in my mind, that's where this mother is stuck. So what usually happens is she's running as hard as she can to keep her and her kids alive and safe. And what we tell her in our messages is that she's lazy, that she's a taker, that she doesn't work hard enough, that she should just pull herself up. All of this work, and frankly, I've never met a single mother who doesn't work harder than I do as an executive director in any of the jobs that I've ever had. This single mother is giving it everything, and she's not getting anywhere because hamster wheels don't move forward. They just keep you running in place. And so we have to think about this. She can't go to a parent-teacher meeting. It's not that she doesn't care about her child's education. There's no room in her pie chart for that. She can't go to a job training. There's no room in her pie chart. She's surviving barely by running this hard on this wheel. There's no room in that wheel for her to put a class so she can get a better job from the 2 dead-end part-time jobs that she has. And this is important to understand as we're designing interventions and programs. We've got to take into account, again, the context of how this person is living and what kind of stress and trauma that life is creating on top of how she's trapped there by the circumstances themselves. Also, if she's making $9 per hour at those 2 jobs, which is more than minimum wage, she's still at that income rate that we just looked at for someone living in poverty. She's still living below the poverty line, working that hard. The other thing is, if we raised her up to 1010, she'd be just above the poverty line. She wouldn't be that far above it, but she might be far enough above it that some of the services that she have would start to get cut off. So we'd actually punish her for doing better. You know, again, we've got to think about our systems and whether or not they make any sense at all when they keep people trapped and they disincentivize work and they disincentivize honesty, and then we blame people for doing what they need to do to survive. Again, that's just more chronic stress. That's just more trauma, and it doesn't make a lot of sense if we really want to succeed as a community, as a society. ACEs, you know, and if you haven't heard of ACEs before, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These are the 10 ACEs that were laid out by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control in the original study that was done in the mid-90s. The study had nothing to do with poverty as it was done. It was focused on middle class and upper middle class patients. But what they found was an incredible prevalence of negative behavioral and physical health outcomes in adults who had experienced any number of these ACEs when they were children. And so the more ACEs you have, the more negative those outcomes may be. Things like heart disease and stroke and suicide attempts and substance abuse, also cancer, and not just cancers that you would expect from smoking or other behaviors from someone who might have experienced these traumas, but cancers that have nothing to do with behavior. There's also a greater prevalence if the person has ACEs. In fact, if the person has had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, their life expectancy is on average 20 years less than someone who hasn't had that same number of adverse childhood experiences. 20 years. On the ACEs survey, I'm an 8. So I'm hoping that that I can beat those statistics too, because I've got a lot more to do in the next 20 years. Why is this so? Again, we come back to that primitive brain and what kept us alive in more dangerous times. Our fight or flight response, fight, flight, or freeze. When we see a dangerous animal, our brains take over. The frontal lobe is shut down, the survival part of our brain kicks in, and our bodies flood with adrenaline and cortisol so that we can either fight that dangerous animal or we can run away fast enough to stay alive. So fight or flight applies to all dangers, and Philadelphia did some great work around this. They looked at the original ACEs study and compared it to a much more diverse urban population with many more people who were living below the poverty line. And what they found was, you know, that there was, in some cases, much more prevalence of adverse childhood experiences for this population of the original Kaiser Permanente study, but also expanded ACEs, that other things count for triggering that fight, flight, or freeze response. You know, witnessing violence, feeling discriminated against, living in an unsafe neighborhood, experiencing bullying, or living in foster care. And so, you know, those 5 additional ACEs, I think, speak to the fact that this is more complex than the original study, and we have a lot more research and work to do. So what happens when fight or flight response gets triggered over and over again in a child? So essentially, why is ACEs such a big deal? And the best way I've heard it explained is by Matthew S. Bennett in his book, Connecting Paradigms. And so imagine you're walking along and you see what you think is a stick. And as you get up to it, it turns out to be a poisonous snake and it attacks you. Well, the next time you're walking along and you see a stick, whether it's a snake or not, your brain is not going to wait for the rest of your mind to process that. The survival part of your brain is going to shut down your frontal lobe, and you're going to feel an adrenaline rush, and that cortisol is going to kick in, and you'll be ready in case it's another snake to either fight it or run. But what happens when every other time you see a stick, it turns out to be a poisonous snake that attacks? Well, after a while, your brain won't let you walk past any stick at all without ringing all the alarm bells. And while that might be a great survival mechanism in a world that's full of poisonous snakes, it starts to hurt you in terms of fitting into our modern world and thriving in our modern context, because things that aren't dangerous look dangerous to your brain. And so you can't quite function normally when you keep getting flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and your fight or flight response keeps kicking in. So this is the meanest teacher I could find. You know, so if you're experiencing abuse at home, and the Department of Health has found that 38% of all Pennsylvanians have experienced either emotional or physical child abuse. 38%. So you're talking about 8 to 10 students out of every classroom are going home to some kind of abuse. If the teacher speaks too loudly when they're upset with you, or stands too close physically and is above you, any number of things that a teacher is doing, or a supervisor at work, could be triggering something that has nothing to do with them. They're not dangerous, but the survival part of your brain is reading something that reminds them of an abuser, someone who came home every day and abused you or your parent, um, someone dangerous in your neighborhood who you had to pass every day on your way to school. Your brain can't tell the difference after a while. It just looks for triggers, and then it sets off the response. And it can be read as a child not being disrespectful or breaking the rules. You know, it's fight, flight, or freeze, and any one of those functions will hurt you in an educational setting. And so the more we understand this, the more we can adjust our behavior as adults trying to care for people to make sure that we're not doing things that might be triggering in as much as we can. The same is true when we ask the question, why did that person run away if they didn't do anything wrong? I would argue that if something about a police officer in general has been triggering to you or your community, that could create a response where your body is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and you're prepared to either fight or run away or freeze and not listen to instructions, which we've seen lead to horrible outcomes in recent years, and probably for a lot longer than that, before we had cameras to track it all. I'd also argue that just anyone, if you've been traumatized or abused, anyone yelling at you who has a weapon could trigger that response. And so we have to think about how we're responding to emergencies and looking through a trauma-informed lens as we have discussions about how policing and education and so many other helping fields need to change their paradigm through trauma-informed care. Here you can just see the chance that some negative outcome that someone is experiencing might be linked back to an adverse childhood experience. And the numbers are alarming of how many times we see abuse or trauma in childhood as a core cause of these later issues. Here you can see, again, there's a healthy brain on the left, and then on the right is a brain scan of a brain that's experienced abuse. And the similarities between abuse and chronic stress in those two brains is pretty alarming and pretty clear. So when we think, oh, that's just stress, it's not just stress if it goes on for a really long time and is continued and chronic. And you can see that it has the same effect as actual abuse if it goes on long enough. And so both of these are very important things to understand as we understand how people get stuck in poverty. You know, how do you get out if the part of your brain in charge of problem solving and good decision making and emotional regulation has been compromised and continues to be compromised by things that trigger the same response, whether they're really dangerous or not? So what do we do about it? Now, that's a lot. So are poverty reduction and healing from trauma even possible? And the short answer is yes, they are. Again, I'm sitting here. I got out because of a lot of luck, but if one person can get out, then a lot of people can get out. And usually we use people like me to beat other people up, like that person got out, why don't you just work harder? If you take the luck factor out and we start doing this work on purpose around trauma and chronic stress and thinking about our policies and our procedures and the way that we approach people, both at the macro level and one-on-one, then we can have a really positive effect. And there's some great tools that we can use to get there. Essentially, we've got to really be thinking about how do we work ourselves out of business and recognizing the feedback loops that trauma creates, not just in poverty, but in all sorts of other community ills, crime, substance abuse, domestic violence, child abuse, you name it. We can see that feedback loop between trauma and poverty there all the time. And that's not to say that that people who are middle class and above don't also experience trauma and chronic stress. But it's to say that it is more prevalent for people that are living in poverty, and that this trauma can keep them stuck there. And so we've got to figure out where we interrupt that cycle and break the status quo so that we can break the cycle. Some of the tools that we can use, and this is not just for the people living in poverty, but for those of us who are engaging in these issues or who are doing this work, especially on the front lines every day, we can experience secondary or vicarious trauma by taking these journeys with people who are struggling with poverty or other social ills. And so we've got to think about this not just for the people we serve, but also for ourselves. Things like mindfulness, meditation, deep breathing, different things that we can do to help ourselves calm down. And there's lots of great resources that are out there for us to follow along on with YouTube, and several universities have lots of resources around secondary trauma and trauma itself. Mindfulness resources. There are apps that you can use to help you meditate. Taking just 10 or 15 minutes a day to calm yourself down or to de-stress can be incredibly important. Trauma therapy, so full-blown therapy. And around this, we have to work on people having access to providers as well as having access to insurance coverage for these sorts of therapies. But we know that there are some proven therapies that work to help people not just process what happened to them and heal, but also heal from that. And so often this journey into being trauma informed switches our mindset from saying what's wrong with you to saying what happened to you, and understanding that what happened, that context, is what's driving behavior, it's what's driving outcomes. And so if we can change that, then really good things can happen. Yoga is another proven therapy for people who are experiencing chronic stress and have experienced trauma. Reconnecting with the body, and again, breathing, those practices of yoga can be really therapeutic. The arts, which so often gets cut in our schools, and it's one of those things that we know helps people who experience trauma. Many therapists had children drawing after 9/11 to help them process what happened to their families, and a lost parent or loved one as a result of that attack. We know that writing, drawing, dancing, music, theater, these things all help people process what happened to them and start to heal. Relationships, and I can't stress this enough, having one stable adult in your life when everything else is dysfunctional or chronically stressful. A good stable adult relationships can be key to helping someone move on from trauma. And finally, I'll say there have been great studies. Harvard did the adult capability study and found that while it's true that a lot of our brain development happens from birth to age 3, that our brains, the part of our brains in charge of executive function and problem solving and emotional regulation, don't stop developing until we're 25 or 30 years old. We also used to think that once our brains were developed, it was all downhill from there. There was no plasticity in our brain to continue to heal and develop. And that's we're finding is also not true. Scientists are finding that brain plasticity might last for your entire life. You might be able to continue to heal and train your brain in new ways throughout your entire lifespan. Another big tool that I encourage people to use as they're doing this kind of work is the social ecological model, which is a public health tool that's been around for a really long time. And it takes what usually happens and kind of opens it up. So what usually happens is we either say the individual needs to change their behavior, kind of, just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or that it's all a rigged system. It's that it's unjust policy. It's institutional issues, and those need to change, and everything would be fine. And in public health, there's sort of an embrace that both of those things have some truth, and there are also 3 other strata that we have to look at if we want to move big community issues. And so on the individual level, the person does have to change behaviors. We have to look at their knowledge and attitudes, their skills, their intentions, and their values. We have to help people make the good decisions on a regular basis. Interpersonal resources matter as well. Social capital, your social influences in your family and your circle of friends, your support system, neighbors, work peers. And we know, again, people living in poverty have some of these folks, but most of these folks are what we call bonding capital and not bridging capital, in that they're not a network that can help somebody get a better job or move on to some other level in their lives in Maslow's hierarchy. And so helping people build more social capital and more diverse social capital is important. Organizational change. Organizations have to look at the way that they're doing the work. What's the culture of the organization, the policy and the norms? This is why becoming a trauma-informed state and helping our organizations become trauma-informed is so important. Being trauma-informed can't just be checking a box. It has to be a part of how you change your culture. and that's incredibly important. Community. What are the strengths of our communities and the norms? Are they helpful or hurtful? Are they barriers to doing better? And we have to understand that and either lean on the strengths or change some of the weaknesses in our communities to succeed. Policy, again, it is important that we change legislation and policy and regulations to help us not re-traumatize people and to help us form, again, programs and interventions that actually match the context of people living in poverty so that they can process what's happened to them, heal from it, and then move up Maslow's hierarchy and thrive and become folks that don't need these interventions anymore. One of the best examples that I can give you of the social ecological model working is seatbelts. And so I was born in 1970, and when I was a little kid, my seat in my grandparents' green Ford LTD was the armrest in the middle of the bench seat in the front. And my 5-point harness was my grandmother's left hand slapping across my chest every time my grandfather hit the brakes too hard or did something that wasn't so great. And we could ride in the way back of a station wagon or the back of a pickup truck, and all that was legal. And so, as we changed this, we did it using the social ecological model. We ultimately needed people to click their own seatbelt. Personal behavior is the key, right? And now most of us do that. And back in 1970, most people would say, no, I don't wear a seatbelt. So the individual behavior is important. We needed peer pressure. We needed people to kind of say to each other, aren't you going to put your seatbelt on before we get going here? That was important as a part of this. And we were trained to do that as these attitudes were shifting. Organizations had to change the way that they made cars. And if you remember, car makers started changing all kinds of things about seatbelts to make them easier and safer. In fact, one of the most annoying evolutions of that was in the 90s when they started making seatbelts that would close slowly and automatically for you as soon as you close the door. I hated those, and I'm glad they went away. But that was part of that. Communities did all sorts of displays on what happens if you don't wear your seatbelt, and there were PSAs to change community attitudes. And finally, policies had to change. So it went from being legal to being something you could get a ticket for if you were pulled over for something else, to ultimately being something you can get pulled over for and getting a ticket. And so now as I do this training in person, I'll ask rooms sometimes as large as 400 or 500 people, how many of you wore your seatbelt when you came here today? And pretty much every hand goes up. That would have seemed impossible back in the 1970s to get to that place. Just like it might seem impossible that we're going to ever be able to tackle poverty, but it's not impossible. We just need to change our paradigms if we want to get there, and we need to use some proven evidence-based methods as frameworks to figure out the way we do very individualized, person-centered work with people that's focused on their context. So I'll leave you with this general idea that no significant learning occurs without a significant relationship. And I put a little fisherman there on purpose. My grandfather had 3 daughters. And so when I was born and kind of became a de facto 4th child for my grandparents because of my mother's age, my grandfather was very excited about teaching me how to fish. I swear, my grandfather was a carpenter. I think he only worked so that he could afford his fishing habit. And so he would get me up starting at when I was 9 years old. He'd get me up at some ungodly hour of the morning, like 4 o'clock or something, and we'd go out and go fishing. And I hated every minute of it. Sitting in the boat, so early, I'm exhausted, watching the line. I'm just supposed to watch it do nothing all day. Nothing's biting my line most days. I'd sneak comic books along to read. And invariably, because I wasn't paying attention, my fishing line would get all tangled up in the reel. I'd have this ridiculous bird's nest in the reel. And he would always get frustrated and take my rod and give me his to hold while he was untangling the mess that I'd made in my reel. And 9 times out of 10, while I was holding his rod, I would catch a fish, which would just get him even angrier. And this one time we usually went on a rowboat, but this one time we chartered a fishing boat, went on a charter trip, and everybody at the beginning of this fishing trip put a couple of bucks into a pot, and whoever won the biggest fish got half the pot at the end of the day. And I won the pot. I won the pot on his rod while he was untangling the bird's nest that was on my rod. And I was 22 years old at the time. My point in telling you that story is we always throw around the cliche that we could give a person a fish or we could teach them how to fish. And I would argue with you that teaching a person how to fish requires loving them, because there's no way that you spend 13 years trying to teach some knucklehead how to fish uh, and having them still mess up 13 years later, unless you love them. Sometimes when we're trying to teach people how to fish, they don't want to learn how to fish. They don't think they need to. They don't see the need for all that extra work, and so it takes patience, and it's hard, and you have to really care about them, even when they mess up. You have to really care about them to get them to a different place. And so I think relationships are key as we're helping people who've experienced all kinds of chronic stress and trauma and all kinds of contextual pieces of their lives that we might never have lived through and never understood. And we have to get to that place where we understand those aspects and understand them as people just like us, who aren't an other, who just need us to meet them where they are and move patiently with them in a deeper relationship than just the transactional, here's a fish, to be able to get to a different place. And so that's all I've got for you today. If you have any questions, I am available at my email address or the phone number on the screen. I am happy to have conversations with folks or meetings with folks. If you've had any questions or comments or aha moments out of today's training. And I appreciate everything that you do. It's people like you that helped me and my sisters get to a different place than our parents were in. We wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here without people like you who really cared and found places and ways to intercede in my life that helped a lot. And so thank you. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for what you'll do with this information after being a part of this training. And bless you for your work and good luck with everything.